You've heard it 1,000 times. Tithing opens the windows of heaven. But what if you've been doing it all wrong? What if the truth about Abraham's giving is so revolutionary, it could transform your finances in ways that defy all logic? Because there's a secret, buried for millennia. A secret Kathryn Kuhlman uncovered when she witnessed financial miracles unfold before her very eyes. And today, you'll understand why Abraham's giving was unlike anything you've ever seen. Pause for a moment, breathe deeply, and tell me something. How many times have you tithed expecting a miracle that never came? How many times have you questioned if God really opens those famous windows of heaven? I know how you feel. I know that silent anguish, that gnawing feeling inside when you do everything right and nothing changes. When you give with faith, pray with fervor, and your finances remain strained. But what if I told you there's a dimension of giving that completely transcends religious obligation? A dimension Abraham accessed long before the law existed, long before 10% became the rule. And Kathryn Kuhlman, that extraordinary woman who moved mountains through faith, she discovered something about this secret that will make you rethink everything you know about supernatural provision. Because see, when Abraham gave his tithe to Melchizedek, something unique happened. Something that was never replicated in the same way in biblical history. And this something could be the key to you experiencing provision in ways that seem impossible. Kathryn used to say, there's a difference between giving out of obligation and giving out of revelation. And that difference, my friend, is what separates those who live in scarcity from those who walk in supernatural abundance. Have you noticed that Abraham didn't tithe because someone told him to? He didn't give because there was a rule. He didn't give because a pastor said it was mandatory. Abraham gave because something inside him recognized a spiritual dimension that transcended the natural world. And therein lies the first secret almost no one tells you. Abraham's giving wasn't an act of obedience. It was an act of recognition. Recognition of a spiritual authority that operated beyond the laws of the earth. But wait, because it gets even deeper. When Melchizedek blessed Abraham, he said something specific. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Do you see what's happening here? Melchizedek is declaring a reality about universal ownership. And Abraham, in giving his tithe, wasn't just giving money. He was entering into a cosmic covenant. A covenant that connected the physical world with the spiritual world in a way that unleashed provision from dimensions you can't even imagine. Kathryn Kuhlman lived this out in practice. She saw people who applied this principle of recognition, not obligation, receive provisions that seemed to come from nowhere. Checks arriving in the mail without explanation. It was 10% of the spoils of victory. It was 10% of what he had conquered through supernatural victory. Are you understanding the difference? Abraham didn't give from what he already possessed. He gave from what God had just given him through divine intervention. He gave from the miracle to perpetuate the miracle. And that's the key that Kathryn Kuhlman discovered. That's the dimension she accessed when she saw impossible provisions happen. She understood that there's a sacred cycle between receiving supernaturally and giving supernaturally. Because see, when you give from your salary, from your money earned through human effort, you're operating in a natural dimension. But when you give from what God has multiplied, from what God has provided inexplicably, you're operating in a supernatural dimension. And it's in that dimension that the windows of heaven truly open. Have you experienced this? Have you lived a moment where something came to you so inexplicably that you knew it was God? And did you give a percentage of that back? Because that's where the true miracle of provision begins to manifest. Kathryn told the story of a woman who received a $500 check in the mail. No sender, no explanation, and instead of keeping it all, she gave $50 as a tithe of that miracle. Do you know what happened in the following 2 weeks? She received $3,000 from completely different and inexplicable sources. Why? Because she entered the Abrahamic cycle, the cycle of supernatural recognition. But wait, because there's yet another level to this revelation. The moment Abraham gave his tithe wasn't coincidental. It was right after he had defeated 4 kings with only 318 men. It was right after a victory that defied all military logic of the time. And Melchizedek appeared at that precise moment, as if the universe conspired to create this sacred encounter between impossible victory and supernatural recognition. Do you see the pattern? God provides miraculously. You recognize through giving, and then God multiplies the provision. It's a self-feeding cycle, a sacred circle of abundance that transcends the limitations of the natural world. Kathryn Kuhlman lived in this circle. She received offerings from people who had been touched by the miracles, and those offerings were invested in more miracles. It was a current of supernatural provision that never broke. And the most extraordinary thing is that this principle still works today. Because spiritual laws haven't changed. What Abraham accessed is still available. What Kathryn experienced can still be experienced. But there's a condition that most people don't understand. You need to give from the place of recognition, not obligation. You need to give because something inside you recognizes that there's a dimension of spiritual authority operating in your life, not because someone told you you should. And you need to give especially from what God has just given you inexplicably, because that's when you enter the Abrahamic cycle. That's when you leave the natural dimension and enter the supernatural dimension of provision. Kathryn would say, God isn't interested in your money. God is interested in your recognition. And when you give from a place of genuine recognition, you're not losing anything. You're planting a seed in a dimension where the harvest defies all natural logic. Because think with me. If God possesses the heavens and the earth, as Melchizedek declared, then the financial limitations you face aren't divine limitations. They're limitations of perspective, limitations of access to the correct dimensions of provision. And Abraham's giving was the key that unlocked those dimensions. It was the acknowledgement that connected the finite with the infinite, the limited with the unlimited. But there's something more. something that will make you understand why so many people tithe and don't see supernatural results. Abraham didn't give out of fear. He didn't give because someone threatened him with a curse. He didn't give because he read somewhere that he should give. Abraham gave out of reverence, out of acknowledgement, out of a real experience with the sacred. And that's the difference Kathryn Kuhlman constantly emphasized. The difference between giving out of fear and giving out of love. Between giving out of obligation and giving out of revelation. Between giving to avoid a curse and giving to enter into blessing. Because when you give out of fear, you're operating in the natural dimension of spiritual bartering. I give so that God will give me. But when you give out of acknowledgement, you're operating in the supernatural dimension of the cosmic covenant. And in that dimension, provision doesn't come as a response to your giving. Provision comes as a natural consequence of your alignment with the spiritual laws that govern universal abundance. Have you ever felt that? Ever experienced that moment where giving becomes a pleasure, where you give and feel like you're participating in something bigger than yourself? Because that's exactly what Abraham felt when he encountered Melchizedek. He felt he was participating in a larger reality, a reality where the earth connects with the heaven, where the natural connects with the supernatural. And Kathryn Kuhlman built her entire ministry on that connection. She lived in that dimension where the impossible became routine, where financial miracles happened not as an exception, but as the rule. And what she discovered will revolutionize how you understand provision. She discovered that there's a right time to give, a sacred moment where giving becomes a portal to the impossible. And that moment is precisely when you've just received something that defies natural explanation. Like Abraham, who gave right after an impossible victory. Like the woman with the mysterious check, who gave right after receiving an unexplainable blessing. It's in that moment that giving transcends religion and becomes sacred magic. It's in that moment that you're not just giving money. You're participating in a cosmic ritual that connects your reality with dimensions of abundance you didn't even know existed. And when you understand this secret completely, when you apply this revelation to your life, you'll discover that supernatural provision isn't a promise for the future. It's a reality available now. Because the God who parted the Red Sea, who multiplied loaves and fishes, who rained quail in the desert, that same God is operating today. And he's looking for people who understand how to access the correct dimensions of his provision. People who understand that giving from the right place at the right time with the right heart opens portals that transform impossibilities into routine. And you can be one of those people. You can enter the Abrahamic cycle. You can experience what Kathryn Kuhlman experienced. But there's something even deeper you need to understand. Kathryn discovered that there's a specific spiritual frequency that activates when you give in the way of Abraham. A frequency that literally magnetizes provision to your life. And she learned to tune into that frequency so precisely that financial miracles became predictable in her ministry. Do you want to know what that frequency is? Do you want to understand how it works in practice? Then pay close attention to what I'm going to reveal to you now. When Abraham gave that tithe, he wasn't just transferring money. He was declaring something to the spiritual universe. He was saying, I acknowledge that there's a higher authority that governs the distribution of resources on this earth. And that declaration, my friend, resonates in dimensions you can't even imagine. It resonates in the realm where angels administer divine resources. It resonates in the place where blessings are released. It resonates at the exact frequency that attracts supernatural provision. Kathryn called this an abundance signature, a spiritual signature that you leave registered every time you give from the right place at the right time with the right heart. And you know what's even more impressive? That signature stays active. It doesn't expire. It becomes part of your spiritual identity. And the more you reinforce it, the more powerful it becomes. That's why people like Abraham entered a cycle of blessing that perpetuated for generations. That's why Kathryn Kuhlman lived in a dimension of provision that defied all the economic logic of the time. But there's a crucial detail that almost nobody notices. Abraham's giving was given in an atmosphere of celebration, not obligation. Melchizedek brought bread and wine. It was a feast. It was a celebration of divine victory. And it was in that atmosphere of overflowing gratitude that the giving happened. Have you ever experienced giving like that? With genuine joy? With celebration in your heart? Because the emotional atmosphere of your giving determines the spiritual potency of your seed. When you give complaining, you plant in barren land. When you give out of fear, you plant in contaminated land. But when you give celebrating, as Abraham celebrated, you plant in the most fertile soil of the spiritual realm. And Kathryn Kuhlman taught this through example. She always gave with joy, always celebrated the privilege of participating in the divine work. And that's why she experienced harvests that seemed impossible. But here's the secret that will change everything for you. Kathryn discovered that you don't need to wait to have a lot to start this cycle. You don't need to wait to become rich to give as Abraham gave. Because the secret isn't in the amount. The secret is in the revelation. She taught that you can start by giving 10% of any miracle, no matter how small. Found a coin on the street? Give 10 cents and acknowledge that it was divine provision. Received an unexpected discount? Give a percentage and thank you for the supernatural intervention. Because when you do that, you're training your spirit to recognize divine provision. You're educating your soul to operate in the frequency of abundance. You're preparing yourself for greater miracles. And you know what happens? The spiritual universe begins to trust you with more because you've proven that you recognize the source, because you've proven that you honor divine provision. No matter the size, Kathryn Kuhlman saw this happen constantly. People who started by acknowledging small miracles gradually stepped into dimensions of provision that completely transformed their lives. But there's a part of this revelation that will shock you. Kathryn discovered there's a specific time, exactly 24 hours, after receiving an inexplicable provision, where giving has maximum power. It's as if there's a supernatural window open, a window that closes if you don't take advantage. Have you noticed how Abraham gave a tithe immediately after victory? How the woman with the mysterious check gave within the same week? There's a sacred timing that multiplies the power of your acknowledgement. And when you miss this window, when you let too much time pass, giving remains good, but it loses that supernatural potency that magnetizes future provisions. That's why Kathryn always said, when God surprises you, surprise God back immediately, without delay, because at that moment, you're operating on the same frequency of faith that opened the initial miracle. And there's more. There's something that'll make you completely rethink your financial strategy. Kathryn taught that when you give in this Abrahamic way, you're not diminishing your money. You're investing in a celestial account that yields supernatural compound interest. Interest that manifests in ways you can't even predict. Sometimes it comes as job opportunities, sometimes as income-generating ideas, sometimes as relationships that open doors, sometimes as resources that arrive from completely unexpected sources. But it always comes because you've activated a spiritual law that's more reliable than the law of gravity. The law of divine acknowledgement and multiplication. Have you ever stopped to think that Abraham became the richest man of his time after that encounter with Melchizedek? Have you considered that it wasn't a coincidence? When you honor the Abrahamic principle, you enter into a covenant with the very administrator of celestial resources. And this covenant has benefits that extend far beyond money. Kathryn experienced supernatural because when you align yourself with the laws of divine abundance, your entire life enters a higher dimension. But let me tell you something that could change your life today. Kathryn discovered that you can activate this principle through a specific declaration. A declaration that connects your giving with the same frequency that Abraham accessed. Every time she gave, she declared, as Abraham acknowledged Melchizedek, I acknowledge that the Lord possesses the heavens and the earth. And as Abraham gave from the spoils of divine victory, I give from this provision I have received through your hands. Seems simple? It is simple. But simplicity doesn't diminish the power. In fact, simplicity amplifies the power because you're connecting directly with a pattern established by God Himself. And when you make this declaration with genuine faith, something changes in the spiritual atmosphere around you. Angelic administrators receive specific instructions about your life. Doors that were closed begin to open. Opportunities that seemed impossible begin to arise. Are you ready to test this? Are you ready to move from the religious dimension of tithing and enter the supernatural dimension of Abrahamic acknowledgement? Because I'm going to give you the exact protocol that Kathryn Kuhlman used. The specific method she taught to those who were ready to experience provision beyond imagination. First, you'll spend the next 7 days paying attention to every inexplicable provision that comes your way. It could be a few dollars someone returned that you didn't even remember. It could be an unexpected discount. It could be an opportunity that arose out of nowhere. Second, within 24 hours of each provision, you'll give 10% of it back, not as an obligation, but as acknowledgement, making the declaration I taught you. Third, you'll specifically thank God for the opportunity to participate in the Abrahamic cycle. You'll celebrate as Abraham celebrated with Melchizedek. And fourth, you'll wait, not with anxiety, but with expectation. Because when you plant in a supernatural dimension, the harvest comes in supernatural multiplication. Kathryn saw this work thousands of times. People who were on the brink of bankruptcy entered abundance in a matter of weeks. People who lived paycheck to paycheck began to experience provisions that transcended their monthly income. And do you know why? Because they escaped the prison of natural thinking and entered the freedom of supernatural thinking. They stopped seeing money as a limited resource and began to see it as a channel of infinite abundance. But there's something you need to understand about time. When Abraham gave that tithe, he wasn't thinking about immediate return. He was making an eternal investment, an investment that would benefit not only him, but future generations. And this long-term vision is what separates those who experience occasional provision from those who experience perpetual abundance. Kathryn always said, "You're not just changing your financial situation, you're changing the financial destiny of your family." Because when you establish an Abrahamic pattern, you create a spiritual legacy that is passed down. Your children will grow up seeing miracles. Your grandchildren will inherit a mindset of abundance. Your future generations will operate on a frequency of provision that you established through your acknowledgement. And this isn't spiritual fantasy, it's biblical reality. Abraham established a pattern that benefited Isaac, Jacob, and all subsequent generations, a pattern that is still active today for those who know how to access it. But there's something you need to consider seriously. Kathryn discovered that there's a difference between experiencing occasional provision and living in continuous abundance. And that difference lies in the consistency of acknowledgement. When you acknowledge divine provision only when you're desperate, you create a pattern of scarcity interrupted by miracles. But when you acknowledge divine provision constantly, you create a pattern of continuous abundance. And acknowledging constantly means you see God's hand in everything. In your salary arriving on time, in the job opportunity you have, in the food that's on your table, in the house where you live. Everything is divine provision. Everything deserves acknowledgement. And when you live this way, when you honor God as the source of everything, you enter a dimension of abundance that transcends the fluctuations of the global economy. Kathryn lived like this. She saw every penny as a divine gift. Every opportunity felt like a heavenly intervention. And because of this, Kathryn Kuhlman operated on a frequency where miracles were routine, not the exception. And you can operate on that same frequency. You can step into that same dimension. You can experience the same abundance. But there's one last thing I need to tell you. One final revelation that will complete the picture. Kathryn discovered that when you master the Abrahamic principle, you no longer need to ask God for provision because you become a permanent channel of abundance. And channels don't ask for water. Channels allow the water to flow. When you become a channel of abundance, your only concern is keeping the channel clear, maintaining constant acknowledgement, keeping gratitude flowing, keeping generosity active. And when you do that, Abundance flows through you as naturally as breathing, not as an answer to your prayers, but as a consequence of your spiritual identity. You become someone through whom God can move resources to bless others. And when God can trust you as a channel, He ensures the channel never runs dry. That's why Abraham became the father of multitudes. That's why Kathryn Kuhlman impacted millions. That's why people who apply this principle experience abundance that seems endless. They became partners with God in the distribution of earthly resources. And partners of God don't live in scarcity. Partners of God live in the abundance that allows God's work to happen. Now you understand why Abraham's giving was so different. Why it unlocked a dimension of provision that transformed not only his life, but the history of humankind. Because it wasn't just an act of giving. It was an act of partnership with heaven. It was a declaration that the earth can operate with heaven's resources when someone is willing to acknowledge the true source. And today, right now, you have the same opportunity Abraham had, the same revelation Kathryn Kuhlman experienced, the same invitation to step into a dimension of abundance that transcends all natural limitations. The question isn't whether it works. The question is whether you are ready to transcend religious thinking and enter supernatural thinking. Whether you're ready to step out of the prison of scarcity and into the freedom of abundance. Because on the other side of that decision lies a life you can't even imagine being possible. A life where provision isn't a struggle, but a flow. Where abundance isn't an exception, but the rule. Where financial miracles aren't a dream, but an everyday reality. Abraham's giving opened a portal that remains open, a portal that's waiting for you to walk through. The question is, will you continue living in the natural dimension of limitation? Or will you take the step Abraham took and enter the supernatural dimension of abundance? Because ultimately, the choice is yours. But the opportunity is divine. And divine opportunities don't wait forever. The secret is revealed. The protocol is clear. The invitation is extended. What will you do now?